One of the compelling things about looking back and exploring what happened in the past is that it can help us understand what's happening in the present. And even more, it can help us make better decisions as we step towards the future. I love the idea of being able to research it and then fix it and get it right. I'm sure you have things that you're probably tired of getting wrong and you'd like to do this project with, fix and get it right finally. I find myself curious about what our faith tradition and this sacred text, the Bible, has to say about people who want a fix-it program. The story of the prophet Samuel is long, but it begins with the Hebrew people living in the land of Canaan in their various tribes, and they're just coming out of a couple hundred years marked by war and violence. Their first few hundred years in the land of milk and honey didn't go great. And then there was the era of Samuel, priest, prophet, and the final political leader in that era of the history of Israel. But after that era, there's something else. So let's read 1 Samuel 8, starting with verses 1 through 3. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. After a long era of violence, now the people are seeing corruption on the rise, and they're looking for a way to fix it. A program to become a people marked by justice and peace, not the injustice of these sons of Samuel, nor the violence of the preceding era. I'd like to invite you to imagine this story through the eyes of its author, probably writing this story actually hundreds of years later. And this author is curious about this moment in history because this is a moment they've zeroed in on as a turning point. And in the words of Joe Bluth, the author has realized we made a huge mistake. Continuing in verses 4 through 9, we find out, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. The program the elders come up with is to be like other nations. They later clarify that what they want the king to do is to govern them and fight their battles. I wonder if the idea of earthly military might was relieving. If they thought that that would be the thing that would fix the violence they were experiencing. If that would keep them safe from their political neighbors. They don't even say, we know this is the best of the terrible options we could think of. They just say that they want a king to govern them like other nations. And God responds, They have rejected me. I am the one who freed them from slavery, but they continue to wander off from me. So I will warn them about how their fix-it program will go wrong. I wonder if we can explore this huge mistake with the eyes of a compassionate historian. Is it a good guess that something like fear or desperation zapped this people's imagination? It can be scary to do anything in a new way, much less in the middle of crisis. Might it have just seemed safer to try what all the other nations were doing? They must have been extremely scared and extremely desperate. It's wild that what God freed them from, they want to return to. That's the best solution they can come up with. There's no room for exploring other possibilities. So Samuel warns the people how it will go, and hundreds of pages later in the story, we find out that it takes exactly 3 generations of kings for the warning to come true. And here's the warning. It begins in verse 10. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourself. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." This is the story of a king who extracts from the people to build up his royal court and the wealthy elite, and to build up his military might. Chariots and horsemen are the warriors and instruments of war. Beyond that, they're commanders and implements of war. And the rest of what is taken isn't taken for the benefit of the people, but for the court, the wealthy elite. It goes so far to say that the people shall be his slaves. The king who ends up fitting this description is Solomon, and it takes a few generations for the seat of political power to build up this way. The generation who got this all started traded the possibility of peace for the relief of a huge standing army. There's nothing quite like fear to lead us towards panicked fix-it programs, is there? Especially these kinds where we try to copycat someone else. And even worse, when we try to be the one to gather in and retain the power and force in order to keep ourselves safe from it. The people go on to insist that they must have a king in spite of the warning. And in verse 22, we hear that the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Listen to their voice. And so Samuel does. For the centuries that follow, God will act in relationship with the king, through the king, at other times in spite of the king, and sometimes against the king. Sometimes God shows up in mighty and powerful ways to save, and sometimes when the people are in great need and they are desperate for help, they don't get it. That warning is clarified in verse 18. There will be consequences for their mistake. But none of these things are any different than how it was before. In spite of their mistake, God goes with them. There was no bend in the road that took them completely away from their relationship with God. I mean, they take a left turn, but God takes a left turn too, and chooses the king and anoints him and the next one and the next. There's nowhere that is too far for God to go. I really wanted to get to the end of this sermon and be able to say, don't vote for the stockpiling of weapons. It's a mistake. And you'll be cut off if you do it. The end. And I stand by that. Stockpiling of weapons is a mistake. But that's not the end of this sermon. I have to say that our Savior was never the political power or the military might. And it will never be the political power or the military might. The existence of that power can't take us away from God or remove God from us. Our Savior was always God and still is God. This story is a case of problem solving gone terribly wrong. And I hope you're a little encouraged by it, or a lot encouraged by it. The history shows that no matter the turns his people take, God stays. And they take some really bad turns. Life presents all of us with incredibly difficult questions, and sometimes you'll just choose a way, and maybe it won't be a good one. But you can't choose your way out of God walking with you, out of the possibility of peace and justice. The possibility remains, and God remains, no matter what.